I am going to do another bread recipe today. A fan of the website sent me a bread recipe, and as she said, and I agree with her, you can never have enough bread recipes. She sent me this recipe for a honey whole wheat bread. Sounds promising. It'll be a little bit sweet because there's a good amount of honey in it. Uses some whole wheat flour, but not a lot. This just seems like it'll be a nice general purpose bread. Good for toast with butter on it, maybe making sandwiches. So let's get into making this honey whole wheat bread. I'm going to start off by proofing my yeast. I have 1 tablespoon of active dry yeast. There you can use a cube of cake yeast. You can use instant yeast. It's not going to matter because we're going to be proofing it. And then I have a pinch of sugar. This is about 1/8 of a teaspoon. And I heated on the stove 1/2 cup plus 2 tablespoons. So that's 118 milliliters plus 2 tablespoons of water. I heated this up to about 110 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 43 degrees Celsius. I'm going to put that in my bowl. Give that a quick stir. And then I'm going to set this aside for about 5 minutes. If the yeast is vital and alive, it should get foamy after a few minutes. Meanwhile, I'm going to heat my beer up. I like to use beer when making bread. This is a 12-ounce bottle, which is 355 milliliters of lager beer. I like to use beer when making bread because I feel as though it gives the bread I describe it as a breadier flavor. So I'm going to put this on the stove and heat this up to 110 degrees Fahrenheit, 43 degrees Celsius. My beer now is heated up. This is 1/4 cup or 3 ounces, 85 grams of honey. I'm using regular clover honey that I bought at the warehouse store, Costco. You can use your favorite honey that you like. My favorite is actually orange blossom honey. And I'm going to stir this in to dissolve it. And then I can return back to my yeast and start working with flour. My yeast is foaming nicely in there, so I know my yeast is active. I keep my yeast in the freezer, and I can keep it well beyond the expiration date, like a year sometimes beyond the expiration date. I buy it in the big bulk pack at the warehouse store. Because I make a lot of bread. I make bread like every other week. I make bread. All right. Ooh, that smells wonderful. So I've combined my beer honey mixture with my yeast. And now what I have here is 4 cups, 20 ounces, 576 grams of white unbleached bread flour. Obviously, those of you who are on a low or no gluten diet aren't going to be going this far. Okay, I'm going to put about half of my flour in there to start off with, and then I'm going to stir this in, and I'll transfer this to my stand mixer. Before I finish up with my batter here, I want to add 1 egg to my batter and get that stirred in, and then I'll be ready to set up my stand mixer and add my remaining flours to this. So you can see I have my stand mixer set up. I put the remainder of that white flour in a this was a big plastic jar, and I cut the top off and angled it like that so it makes it easier to work in flour as I'm making bread. I only use this for making bread. So that's the remainder of my bread flour. I have here 1 2/3 cups, 8 ounces, 227 grams of whole wheat flour. I'm going to put that in my container because this is all going to go into the bread. And then I have 2 1/4 teaspoons of salt. I'm going to be using whole butter in my bread dough. That's going to add some salt. If you want to work with unsalted butter or clarified butter, increase this to 1 tablespoon of salt. And then what I have set aside in case I need it is I have up to 1/2 cup of additional flour. That's about 2.5 ounces of flour. It's just additional flour because I'm going to be looking for a certain consistency in my bread dough, and I won't know if I got there or not until after I've worked in my flour and my whole wheat flour. Okay, so I'm going to turn my machine on here and start adding my flour. And what I'm doing, just so you know, is I'm adding this a little at a time, maybe 1/4 to 1/2 cup at a time, letting that get worked into the batter slash dough, and then when it's looks like it's pretty much thoroughly incorporated, I'll add more and keep going until I incorporate all my flour. Okay, this is looking good so far. I haven't used my extra flour yet, but I'm reserving it. Just to mention something about this, as far as making bread, there are so many things that affect the consistency of the dough. How warm is your kitchen? How humid is it? What's the weather like outside? Right now here in Southern California, the temperature is climbing outside to over 90 degrees. The humidity is already down to about 26%. It might get down to as little as 10 or 11% today. All of that's going to affect making bread. What I want to do is add some butter to this, and once I get a final idea of what my bread dough looks like, then I'll be able to decide whether or not to add a little bit more flour. If I add flour, I'll add it like a tablespoon, maybe even just a teaspoon at a time. What I'm looking for is dough that pulls away from the side of the bowl but still sticks in the bottom of the bowl. That tells me that I have the right consistency for a nice soft bread. So to work in my flour, I'm going to move my hook out of the way. To work in my butter, rather, I'm going to use a knife to cut a hole in my dough. Put a good sized dollop of butter in there. Kind of fold that in. And then as I knead this with the dough hook, it's going to break up because butter and water don't mix. But as you keep working, the butter will get fully incorporated and that dough will come together again. Okay, all my butter is incorporated, and I can't remember whether or not I told you how much butter I put in there. So just in case, that was 1/2 cup or 4 ounces by weight, 113 grams, and I used whole butter. You can use clarified butter or unsalted butter, and the butter was at room temperature, which makes it easier to work in. What I'm seeing here is a dough that's sticking a tiny bit more than I would like to see it sticking, but it's better if it's a little on the moist side than the dry side. So I'm not going to use any of my flour that I set aside here. I'm going to go with this as is. I'm going to take this dough out. Let's just set it on a piece of parchment paper. I'm going to clean out this bowl because I'm going to use this as my bowl to let the dough rise in. So I cleaned out my bowl here. I'm going to put a little plastic storage bag on my hand. Just have some whole butter here. I'm gonna grease this bowl well. That's good enough for right now. I'm gonna come back to that in a moment. Here's my dough. It has a wonderful consistency here. I love the feel of this dough. It's moist, but it's not sticking to my hand, so that tells me I've got just the perfect proportion of dry and wet. I'm going to come back to this and just butter the top. Like so. Okay. And then I have a piece of plastic wrap here. Going to cover this bowl. Set this in a warm place. My favorite place is on top of my refrigerator. I want to wait until this rises until it's double in bulk, and I want to see it just coming up over the rim of this bowl so it mounds up a little bit. That could take 1 to 2 hours. My bread dough is rising slowly. It's going to take 2 hours I've got about 8 minutes left on my second hour, which is okay because that'll just allow more time for the flavor to develop. While I'm waiting, I thought I would explain to you my bread pans because they're going to look a little strange. I like wide bread pans because I want a slice of bread that'll fit in my toaster. My bread pans are 5 inches wide. The problem is they're also shallow. So I get this muffin top, and to get the bread into the toaster, I have to clip its wings off. So I modified my bread pans a little bit. It's a bit OCD, but it works. So let me show you my bread pans just so that you'll understand why they look the way that they look. So I cut these metal flanges here so they fit inside my bread pans. I lined it with parchment paper, that way my bread can rise, but these flanges will hold the sides in so I don't get my muffin top. It's weird, yes, but it works. It's successful for me. You know, you do what you got to do to get what you want, right? So here is my bread dough, and you can see that it's just rising up above the rim of that bowl. You can take that off now. I'm going to just shake this loose, knock it down a little bit. That took exactly 2 hours, by the way, to get that to rise. And then I'm going to divide this in half. That is a nice soft dough. This is going to make a nice moist bread. Set this aside, and then I'm going to shape this into a loaf. By bringing the dough up and pinching it together. And then I should have a fairly nice rounded top to this. This is a very moist dough. And now carefully lift this up and put it inside my pan. So there's my dough in there. I have the other one to do. Then I'm going to cover these with plastic and let these rise. The second rise is going to take anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour and a half, 90 minutes to get the finished rise that I want. My bread dough loaves have been rising again for another 2 hours. This is a slow rising bread dough, but that's okay. The longer it takes to rise, the more it develops a flavor. I'm heating my oven to 375 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 191 degrees Celsius. One of the options in this recipe is to brush egg wash onto the loaves before they go into the oven. There are different egg washes. The most common standard egg wash is you just beat up the egg with some water and salt. That's your egg wash. So here is one of my loaves. I'm going to take my plastic wrap off. I don't need these binder clips anymore. And then one thing I do, if you're not familiar with oven spring, when you put the loaves in the oven, the first 10 minutes or so, they rapidly expand. And to make room for oven spring, you cut a slit in the loaf. And that gives it a way to expand. Obviously, you need a really sharp knife, like a razor sharp knife. I just put a new edge on this knife. Okay, these are now ready to go into the oven. I'm going to bake these for 35 to 45 minutes. I've made so much bread in these bread pans that I just know 40 minutes is usually the right amount of time. So now here they are out of the oven. What I need to do now is I'm going to let these cool in the pan for about 5 minutes. Then I'll transfer the loaves onto my cooling rack, let them cool thoroughly, and then I'll be able to slice them and see what they taste like. I want to slice this open, see what it looks like on the inside. I can tell by the way the knife goes through it. It's a very delicate and soft bread. Slice a nice big slice for myself. Put that on a plate and butter it and see what it tastes like. Very tender bread. I can just tell by the feel of it. It tastes very much like a whole wheat bread. Barely sweet, just a little bit of sweetness from that honey. Delicate, delicious, so excuse me, I'm going to go enjoy my afternoon snack. For a printable PDF copy of this recipe with step-by-step photographs, visit my website, mobilehomegourmet.com, and look on the home page or in the recipe archive.